kind of personal journey, and it's a very good book. And then he was actually had a email newsletter going on for several years before the era of the internet, and so it's been. So, anyways, Joe's going to be doing, and Joe also was the MC for the last and organizer for the last conference that we had in St. Louis, and the one before that too at Columbus, Ohio. Joe's going to be presenting a presentation called "Politics of the Shroud: Carbon-14 Dating," and so I think you'll find this very interesting. So please take your seat. You're all ready?
Am I on?
Yep. I don't know.
Testing?
Test.
Yep, you're on.
Are you on?
Test.
Yep.
Okay.
So when it hits 1, you're done.
1.
Yeah.
Okay. Because.
When it hits the 12, I'm sorry, when the long hand hits the 12 again,
Okay.
you'll be done. And I'll give you a 5-minute.
Okay. I want to thank the organizers of the conference, especially Bob Rucker. It's amazing what he put into this, and he's certainly to be congratulated for putting on such a wonderful conference. I always note when I'm giving a quotation, when I'm citing from something, and I usually say quote, end quote, but this paper has so many quotations that it would be distracting to keep doing that, so I'll try to be judicious in my use of that convention. October 1978, in a paper by the late Harry Gove, inventor of the AMS C14 dating method used on the shroud, presented to a conference in Turin, a paper in which he stated, "It would be preferable to obtain threads from several places throughout the material." March 1979. STIRP held a meeting in Santa Barbara, California to discuss their preliminary findings obtained from the October 1978 testing. The late Dr. Walter McCrone claimed the shroud was a painting based on his studies. Gove gave a presentation and said he believed that the C14 test was the only test worth doing at the present time. He asserted that it would settle once and for all whether the shroud could have wrapped Jesus or was forged recently and therefore was a relic, icon, or intentional hoax. April 1979, Gove phoned the late Robert Diniger of STIRP and expressed concern that McCrone would be involved in the C14 dating. Diniger assured Gove that he would not. Diniger was also told that the C14 scientists wanted to be independent from STIRP and that the shroud sample should not be blind, i.e. identified as the shroud when tested. 1983, each of the 6 labs in a comparison test received 2 100 milligram samples. The labs were informed of the origin of the samples, but not of their ages. One sample was Egyptian linen from 3000 BC, and the other was Peruvian cotton from AD 1200. The Zurich lab, which used a new pre-treatment, was off by 1,000 years on the Egyptian sample. In addition, all 6 labs dated the Peruvian cloth between AD 1400 and 1668. That sample was then replaced, without explanation, with another Peruvian cloth from AD 1000 to 1400. Oh, sorry. It's on my screen here, though. I assumed it was up there. I'm seeing it here. Okay. Great. Let's see. Yeah, let's see. Sorry about that. We'll just pick up where we're at. 1983, a French C14 scientist, the late Dr. Jacques Avan, who would later be involved in supplying a controversial fourth control sample for the 1988 Shroud dating, wrote in an article, "It is evident that the samples to be dated should contain carbon. However, the mere presence of this chemical is not sufficient to produce a valid result. After many years of C14 dating, it has been shown that numerous results are in error or are erroneously interpreted, often because of lack of knowledge about the value of the material selected for dating." 1984, Stirp sent a proposal of 26 tests, which included C14 dating, to the Vatican, who forwarded it to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the body that advises the Pope on scientific matters, and to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The late Professor Luigi Ganella, scientific advisor to the Cardinal of Turin, wrote, "For reasons that Cardinal Balestrero and I were never able to understand, a deployment formed aiming at excluding any research that was not the radiocarbon dating." June 1985, at a C14 conference in Trondheim, Norway, Dinninger told Rainer Berger of UCLA that the real problem with dating the Shroud was not in doing the experiments, but in the politics of obtaining samples. He added that Stirp could handle getting the samples and that the labs would do an excellent job in determining the date. There was a discussion about an incorrect date that one of the labs had gotten in the 1983 intercomparison test held by the British Museum. Hans Aschker of the University of Bern came forth and said he didn't mind identifying his lab as the one who had gotten this particular date at the time. He revealed they didn't know why it happened, as they had gotten good dates before. It apparently caused the lab a lot of embarrassment. July 1985. On July 22nd, just 8 days after Cardinal Ratzinger approved Stirp's plan for 26 tests, Gove met in New York with Victor Canuto of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Monsignor Celli, a Vatican ambassador to the United Nations. Canuto then informed church officials that the tests Stirp proposed were dangerous. 1986. Regarding the Turin C14 planning meeting, Bill Meacham wrote, "The point that I hope to drive home is that there are many things that can go wrong with C14 dating. For some, the cause is unknown, while the others are grouped under the term rogue dates. It is important for anyone wishing to understand the normal archaeological use of C14 to know that a single date, or even a series of dates on a single object or feature, is seldom, if ever, cited to answer important questions about the age of a culture or a site. To put a single radiocarbon date in the position of being the ultimate arbiter of the age of the Shroud of Turin is a blatant departure from the way C14 is normally used. There are simply too many pitfalls. This was not a position that went down well with the hotshots from the radiocarbon labs." 1986. An article in the journal Radiocarbon noted, "The dating of the Shroud of Turin would now be possible in principle, although it is generally agreed that any such measurement ought not to be undertaken by a single laboratory or even by the use of one technique alone." 1986. Al Adler of Stirp recounted his recollections of the Turin C14 planning meeting and the subsequent results. Quote, "I was at that meeting too as the chemical advisor. It was written up in Archaeological Chemistry 4. Bill Meacham pointed out all the things that you could screw up if you didn't have an archaeologist involved in the sampling to advise you what to do and what not to do, and a chemist to tell you what to do and what not to do before you start sampling. That was all in the original protocol. They didn't follow it. They wrote a different protocol. They didn't even follow that. When asked why they took the sample where they took it, the answer was, well, it was cut there before. Now that is the stupidest argument in the world for taking one sample from the place where they took it, because they know that's an area that's been repaired. They know it's by a water stain. They know it's by a scorch. And they know that people have found previous chemical evidence that the area is peculiar. But nevertheless, that's what they did. And that's why we have a date that all sorts of people don't believe, because they don't believe the accuracy of the thing. October 1986, Italian researcher Franco Faia stated, Gove involved the head of the British Museum, getting him to sign something without being aware of what it was. From all over the world, the church was blackmailed, being told, either you let us examine it, or it means you're scared and it's false. Gove even put pressure on the 3 labs chosen to refuse the dating of it if it were carried out only by 3 laboratories. 1987. When changes were made to the original protocol for dating the shroud, Gove wrote to John Paul II, quote, the procedure that the Cardinal of Turin is suggesting is bound to produce a result that will be questioned in strictly scientific terms by many scientists around the world who will be very skeptical of the arbitrarily small statistical basis when it is well known that a better procedure was recommended. Since there is a great world expectation for the date of the shroud, the publicity resulting from a scientifically dubious result will do great harm to the Church. We respectfully urge Your Holiness to persuade the Cardinal of Turin that the scientific advice being given to him is not shared by the world experts in this field. He should be urged to seek the advice of the eminent scientific organization expressly created to advise you, namely the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that enjoys the respect of the scientific world at large. Rather than following an ill-advised procedure that will not generate a reliable date, but will rather give rise to world controversy, we suggest that it would be better not to date the shroud at all, end quote. January 1988, author David Sachs suggested that more than just scientific reasons entered into the decision to reduce the number of labs from 7 to 3. The day that Ganella met with the representatives of the 3 labs, Ian Wilson and Michael Tite, listened to Ganella rant and rave about Harry Gove in the lobby of his hotel. Otlet suggested the real problem was Ganella's distaste for Gove. As Ganella saw it, any change now would be giving in to Gove. The scenario was taking on the dimensions of Homeric feuding and casting coach performances. Sachs added, when Ganella was asked from where the samples might be taken, he appeared vague and then mentioned the area near the side strip. He was reminded that that was where the Reyes samples had come from. One was from the mysterious side strip itself. Ganella appeared unaware that the side strip had always been a questionable matter. It is unknown whether it was originally a part of the shroud or not. Incredibly, Ganella had not brought photographic documentation of the relic with him. January 1988. Although Gove had previously tried to persuade the 3 chosen labs to refuse to do the dating if more labs were added, the labs in Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich decided to proceed with this limitation. According to Sachs, had they refused to do the test, labs in Pisa and Udine would supposedly have been chosen to replace them. Apparently, Ganella believed the 3 labs would not refuse to do it because, as Sachs put it, the prize was too great. January 1988. Gove sent a letter to Sir David Wilson of the British Museum telling him that the dating process had turned into a shoddy enterprise, which Tite and the British Museum might live to regret. And yet, when the date came out, medieval, Gove was happy to accept the dates at face value. February 1988. On February 12th, Tite sent a request to the French C14 expert Jacques Avant to procure a sample that resembled the shroud. Quote, I would certainly much welcome any assistance that you can give in obtaining a medieval control sample which is as similar as possible in terms of weave and color as the shroud. The material of the sample should be linen. We are looking for a sample which dates from the 13th or 14th century AD, preferably the latter." End quote. It is well known that they wanted a control sample that was as physically close to the shroud as possible, but it's intriguing that Tite preferred a sample in the 14th century as opposed to the 13th century. March 1988, Meacham wrote, "Elsewhere, Gove commented on Stirp's desire to characterize the sample before it was dated by saying, whatever that means. This was absolute nonsense. Clearly, he had no concept of or interest in investigating the chemistry of a sample prior to running it through the standard pretreatment. The 3 selected labs were equally blinkered. They would conduct no research on where the sample should come from, and they planned to treat their prized shroud fragment largely as they would any other archaeological specimen." April 1988. Robert Hedges, one of the Oxford C14 scientists, was asked how confident he was of being able to establish the shroud's age. He admitted, "I wouldn't put my life on it." Ted Litherland, who was director of the Isotrace lab in Toronto and co-inventor of the AMS method with Harry Gove, commented about the choice of the area from which the sample was taken. Quote, "All the samples came from one corner. Oh dear, my God, that's no way to run a show." End quote. PhD thesis author Helene Laverdiere, that's a hard one to say for me, sorry. She wrote, quote, "They took every care so that no accusation of possible fraud could be made. The procedures were recorded on videotape so that all the handling of the samples would be well documented. This video was later sold to BBC, who produced a program on the Zurich experiment. It permitted Turin people to repay some of the important expenses incurred by selling the rights to BBC." But the author then continues, "Yet the wrapping of the samples was kept more secret than the rest of the operation. The test was not fully blind anymore, but they still acted as if it was." Side note, in fact, it was later discovered that the putting of the samples in the containers was not actually recorded on videotape. Another control sample was brought in at the last minute by a French textile expert, the late Gabriel Vial, who had received it from Jacques Avan, whom Tite had previously asked to find a control sample similar to the shroud. Laverdiere noted, "They decided there and then to include it in the controls." April 1988. When Luigi di Numana cut the sample, Cardinal Balistrero curiously remarked, "The crime is accomplished." Testori recommended taking more than what the labs requested in case one of the 3 came up with a significantly different date from the other 2. Italian researcher Marinelli said, quote, "Also regards the weights, there later were pronouncements that gave different weights. Dr. Belloni of the Turin Centro commented, 'These weights do not correspond with what is seen on the scales used to weigh the material at the time of the sampling. As far as I'm aware, these inconsistencies have never been explained.' The actual measurements of the 3 samples were shown as 52 milligrams for the first sample, 52.8 for the second, 53.7 in 2 parts for the third sample, which went to Arizona. Testori commented regarding the packaging of the samples, "There was something we didn't understand when, how the 3 samples were put into their containers. There was only Cardinal Balistrero and Tite, the director of the British Museum. That was all, in a separate room from where we were, but they came back and sealed them in public." La Stampa journalist Marco Tostati noted, "Once again, we are faced with something that raises questions within a procedure that should have been followed absolutely rigidly to avoid any possibility of doubt or misinterpretation." May 1988. Arizona violated its signed agreement with Turin by inviting Harry Gove into their laboratory for their testing of the shroud sample. Gove, who had been insisting, without foundation, that Stirp was nothing more than a fanatical group of Christian believers, told the journalist, "Almost without exception, they were people who honestly believe it is Christ's shroud," he said. "It's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want. If you believe that passionately in something, you can steer the results. My God, we've all been guilty of that." Well, that works both ways. One has to ask if any of the agnostic or atheistic C14 scientists consciously or unconsciously steered results. May 1988. Although everything related to the results was to be confidential, no less than a BBC TV crew filmed the testing at the Zurich lab. The program was broadcast well before the announcement of the dates on October 13th. Sachs, who was present for the filming, wrote in his book that Wolfley identified 2 of the samples as twill weave and 1 as tabby weave. The shroud was known to be herringbone weave, which made it easily recognizable and which also negated the blind procedure. Tite claimed in an interview that the decision to abandon the blind testing was made as the samples were being extracted. A third violation of the confidentiality agreement was made by Gove, who wagered a pair of cowboy boots in a bet with his assistant Shirley Brignall on the shroud's dating. Ganella complained, "The experts at the British Museum did not trust the cardinal and wanted to be present when the samples were taken from the shroud, but then they did not allow a representative of the church to watch the analysis as an observer." Piero Savarino, who would later become the scientific advisor to Turin Cardinal Poletto, remarked, "This behavior is truly incomprehensible. It is to be considered that in any legal ambit, any analysis performed in the absence of the other party is rejected by the courts." August 1988. The leaks culminated in a story in the London Evening Standard on August 26th with the front page headline, "The Shroud is a Fake," which quoted historian Richard Luckett of Magdalen College in Cambridge, who said, "Laboratories are rather leaky institutions." Rigi said, "The laboratories committed themselves on their honor to provide that nothing would have leaked. Instead, they have exploited the research. They used the rumors to promote themselves. For sure, they don't come out clean." Hall candidly stated, quote, "Frankly, I think it was a hopeless prospect to keep the results secret. You couldn't, with the best will in the world," end quote. Well, yes, they could have kept it secret. You honor the agreements you sign, you don't invite guests into the testing, and you don't reveal the results beforehand. People with integrity can do that. October 1988. A few days before the dating, Meacham composed a letter to the British Museum, which he copied to Stirp, Ganella, and several news agencies, in which he wrote, "In sum, the British Museum has much to answer for in its involvement. 1. Why did it acquiesce in the reduction of samples to be taken from 7 to 3 against the recommendation of the Turin Commission? 2. Why did it agree to the elimination of the small counter laboratories which employ a more reliable counting system? 3. Why did it agree to only one sampling site, thereby raising the possibility of an anomalous zone being dated? 4. Why did it agree to the sampling of a scorched area of the cloth, again in conflict with the recommendation of the Turin Commission? 5. Did it approve the choice of a textile expert? And is it satisfied that its visual inspection of the sample area is sufficient to rule out any possibility of a restoration or reweaving of that area? 6. Why did it not follow its own guidelines in the intercomparison experiment and insist that samples be taken well away from selvages, or is 2 to 3 centimeters considered to be well away? October 1988. Cardinal Balestrero announced on October 13th the test results of AD 1260 to 1390 for the shroud, and that the church had no reason to doubt the results. That afternoon in London, Tite, Hall, and Hedges held a press conference at which was placed on a blackboard 1260 to 1390, exclamation point. Tite gave an interview to a French radio station in 1989 saying he didn't remember who wrote that on the board. Hall triumphantly pronounced that nobody scientifically trustworthy could now deny that the shroud was a fake. The Cardinal's statement appeared the next day in the official Vatican newspaper Osservatore Romano, ostensibly accepting the results, but the Vatican would question the results in another pronouncement made in August 1990. Rigi stated, we believe that a single test, unconnected with the other 25 proposed, cannot give a reliable answer. Although Tite had claimed in 1989 that he couldn't remember who wrote the 1260 to 1390 on the blackboard, in a BBC 2016 interview, he stated that he had written it. How does he forget 1 year after the event who wrote it, and then 27 years later remember that he himself wrote it? November 1988, archaeologist the late Eugenia Notowski wrote, "In any form of inquiry or scientific discipline, it is the weight of evidence which must be considered conclusive. In archaeology, if there are 10 lines of evidence, carbon dating being one of them, and it conflicts with the other 9, there is little hesitation to throw out the carbon date as inaccurate due to unforeseen contamination. The shroud should not be given less than standard procedure. Clearly, in this instance, the carbon date is conflicting with the weight of evidence." December 1988. According to Italian authors Petrosillo and Marinelli, Nature received on December 5th the paper from the 21 scientists, quote, "even though the scientific text still had to be reviewed by peers and published in a specialized periodical before it was communicated to the public," end quote. Even though the Colonetti Institute in Turin had originally been chosen to be one of 3 institutions to analyze the results, the laboratory had asked that the work be entrusted to Tite because of his supposed independence. Ganella noted, "Any Italian would have been looked upon with suspicion, and anyone from Turin would be doubly suspect. We accepted because we were in the situation that, if anyone had objected, his objection would have been interpreted as an obvious proof of the desire to cheat." January 1989, German author Kirsten sent photographs of the Zurich specimen Z1, one of the samples dated 1988, to Belgian textile expert Professor Gilbert Reyes to compare with photographs of the sample that Reyes had received in 1973. Kirsten quotes Reyes, "I have compared the specimen which I received in 1973 with Professor Wolfe's photos. I must state that the general appearance is quite different. What could be the reason for this difference? In each case, the main difference lies in the differing number of threads per centimeter in the direction of warp and weft. It is not easy to count the number on a photograph, but I did not find the same number as on the piece I received in 1973. I may conclude that the 2 specimens cannot come from the same item. That is my impression when looking at the specimens." January 1989, Kirsten interviewed Susan Black, former General Secretary of the British Society for the Turin Shroud. Kirsten asked if Tite was bribable. She replied, "Oh, I don't know about that. You just don't know. Every man has his price. There may be something that I don't know." Black also commented, "Everything that could have been done wrong has been done wrong, and none of the things that were suggested by the Harwell Laboratory, which was an objective outside laboratory, were done at all. Something strange there." February 1989, the Nature issue dated February 16th had the official report and was titled "Radiocarbon Dating of the Shroud of Turin," which had 21 signatories, with Paul Damon of Arizona being listed first. According to the report, these results therefore provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. The report gives the impression that each lab used up all of its samples, but it was later revealed that Arizona and Zurich each had preserved a portion. And a side note, according to Adler in a conversation with Mark Antonacci, Oxford, March 1989. £100,000 from ITV, the BBC's rival, and also 5 businessmen and rich friends. Who took over Hall's position? It was Dr. Michael Tite from the British Museum, who was supposedly the independent overseer of the Shroud dating. Ganella commented, "Since the beginning, this story of dating the Shroud has been vitiated by publicistic aspects to which the C14 laboratories showed to be even too much sensitive." Ganella further criticized the C14 scientist, quote, "who took the liberty of violating the secret and of announcing to scandal-seeking tabloids that the Shroud is a medieval fake. In my opinion, there is an anti-Catholic conspiracy of specific milieus." Ganella didn't specify which milieus, but in a later interview, Cardinal Balestrero was asked, "In this whole affair, could the Freemasonry have had a hand and external pressures?" The Cardinal replied, "I think it's indisputable." One wonders if the Freemasonry aspect is what Cardinal Balestrero had in mind when he remarked when the sample was taken, "The crime is accomplished." But if that was the case, then the question becomes, why didn't he try to get the Vatican to hold off on the test? Spring 1989. Ganella stated, "After what has happened, I think that nobody has the courage anymore to speak of the good faith of the laboratories. In the history of C14 dating, never had laboratories themselves requested to date a specimen, and never had 7 labs at once wanted to date the same object. Normally, a scholar submits a proposal to the laboratories and asks for their responses. According to Ganella, but this time, the laboratories that specialized in carbon-14 dating wanted to act as their own submitters. The fact is that right from the beginning of the Shroud dating affair was vitiated by publicity aspects to which the carbon-14 laboratories showed themselves to be excessively sensitive. We are not satisfied with the way the laboratories conducted their study of the Shroud. It is true to say that the attitudes of the analysts influenced this judgment. For instance, they insisted on being present at all costs during the cutting operations because they did not trust the officials of the church. But on the other hand, they did not invite the experts who enjoyed the trust of the church to be present during their examinations. Since when has a dating laboratory wanted to be present during an excavation because it did not trust the archaeologist who was excavating the specimens? Since when have laboratories refused to collaborate? The management of the investigation was left completely in the hands of non-Catholic experts without any effective guarantee of secrecy or that they would respect the agreement not to determine during the tests which was the Shroud specimen out of those submitted to them. Such criticism was directed toward Cardinal Balestrero, end quote. Ganella continued, "The church found itself faced with a challenge issued by a number of persons who by their demands were doing all they could to be told no so that they could say the church was afraid of science. Therefore, faced with this danger, it was decided to proceed with the scientific examination at all costs, even at the risk of protest." Ganella continued, "It was blackmail. They put us with our backs to the wall with their blackmail. Either we accepted the carbon-14 test with the conditions imposed by the laboratories, or they would unleash campaign of accusation against the church, saying it was afraid of truth and it was the enemy of science." In the communication of October 13th, however, Cardinal Balestrero had spoken of a reasonable operational program. Ganella was asked if the ideological passion of the C14 scientists could have negatively affected the results. Ganella replied, "I do not know. It is very difficult to say. What is certain is that when people behave in such an unusual manner, it is possible to think anything. But it would not scientifically or morally be proper to deliver such a rash judgment. They behaved like dogs. I protest against their complete lack of professionalism in the field of deontology. I protest against the infamous method they followed. I told them to their faces they were mafiosi." I'm just going to go briefly over this just in the interest of saving time. A Shroud researcher who doesn't want to be named because he's not sure about the whole situation, so I call him Harry. He received a call from somebody in the spring of 1989, about 1:30 in the morning, and this person sounded very distraught. And the person basically admitted to screwing up the C14 dating and said that the real sample had been thrown away. And Harry said he thought the person could have been in his 40s, maybe had a German accent. And he sounded so distraught that Harry said if he had said, I'm going to pull out a gun and shoot myself, he wouldn't have been surprised. And even now, Harry's not sure what to think, but it's an interesting story, and I thought I'd put it in here. May 1989. A Shroud conference was held in Bologna, Italy. For some reason, both Ganella and Rigi were not invited. Kirsten had hoped to meet with Rigi there, but instead made arrangements to meet with him in his office in Turin. Rigi first told Kirsten that he would be willing to show him and his co-author Gruber the 10 to 12 hours of video footage from the sampling. But according to Rigi, Ganella objected, so Kirsten and Gruber were only able to see an edited version. Kirsten commented, "One has to ask why an apparently uninterrupted video recording, excluding the episode in the sacristy, was made if people were not going to be allowed to view it as it stood. Would it not have been better to drop the documentation entirely, just as the verbal protocol had simply been dropped? What use was the assurance that everything proceeded correctly and was perfectly documented if no one was allowed to check? They had evidently also decided against having a notary confirm the events." May 1989, Ganella is still accusing the labs. He accused them of intoxication by success and added, "Misconducts, there were tons." The colleagues of the C14 behaved in a disgusting manner. Those scientists have hatched a true plot to discredit the Shroud. At first, when they did ask us to examine a sample of the Shroud, assured us of the utmost seriousness and completeness of the analyses, along with the collaboration with the custodian of the Shroud, that is the Bishop of Turin, and his scientific advisor, i.e. the undersigned. Driven by celebrity fever, those scientists began to turn their backs on their own commitments. No more interdisciplinary examinations, only C14. They flooded even Rome with pressure so that Turin had to accept their conditions. They used the then president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, Professor Chagas, to get the undersigned out of the way and go their own way. May 1989. At the Bologna conference, Father Werner Bull stated, "What is still lacking is adequate documentation about the operation of removing the samples. A correct documentation on this has never been done. No notarized acts as in 1989, and there were only 9 photographs. The gravest suspicions still weigh on the conduct of Dr. Tite." September 1989. At the International Scientific Symposium held in Paris, the scientific committee made a declaration that there were reservations on the statistical analysis of the results, especially on the 6.4 value of the chi-square tests, which indicate that the samples were not homogeneous. The committee requested the release of all the raw data from the 3 labs, as well as a commentary written by Professor Bray of the Colinetti. Side note, the 3 labs did not release the data at the time of the request. Apparently some of the raw data was revealed according to an Italian documentary that came out in 2011, but the circumstances of how that was revealed isn't clear. September 1989. To gauge the general reliability of C14 dating, an intercomparison trial among 38 labs took place in Scotland. The organizers concluded that the margin of error was 2 to 3 times greater than previously claimed. Of the 38 labs, only 7 produced satisfactory results. September 1989, French monk Brother Bruno Bonnet-Aimard interviewed Gonella at the Paris Symposium. Gonella wouldn't answer specific questions, but cryptically said, between 1984 and 1988, a whole lot of things happened which I cannot enlarge on. Some of them, however, were inexplicable and unexplained. September 1989. Brother Bruno had been passing out one of his articles in which he recounted all the various discrepancies and inconsistencies given out by those who had been involved in the excision of the sample. Luigi Di Numana was supposed to have presented a paper titled Sample Taking from the Shroud, 21 April 1988, in which he was supposed to provide commentary on a 20-minute video. Right before he was to speak, Luigi Di Numana, who held a written report in his hand, told the person next to him, I shall not be speaking. The video was shown without the expected commentary by Luigi Di Numana. As far as I know, he didn't take ill, but it's unknown why he wouldn't speak. It was just one more of the many strange events in the preparation, execution, and aftermath of the C14 dating. September 1989, the late Professor Jérôme Lejeune, a distinguished French scientist of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, during the Paris Congress said, this phenomena of changing mind over the protocol in the middle of the sample removing, well, what could that have been for? I don't see, but it pushed them into a major methodological error, which in my opinion makes the experiment as it was done quite pointless. The fact is that having inopportunely renounced the double-blind procedure, they calmly told the laboratories the ages of the witness samples. The results were invalidated by procedural defects. I put this objection to Dr. Tite. I said to him, but why did you reveal the age of your control samples, which meant that you no longer had control samples? He gave me this staggering answer. You are the first person to have made this criticism, and I confess I have no answer. Your criticism is well-founded. April 1990. As with the Paris conference, where he was to have presented and didn't show and didn't delegate anyone to read a paper, Hall was scheduled to attend the Shroud Conference in Cagliari, Italy, and present a paper titled An Attempt to Answer Criticism Concerning the Dating of the Shroud. But he didn't show and he didn't send anyone to read the paper in his place. August 1990. On August 18th, the Vatican Press Office stated in its bulletin, the result of the medieval dating became an odd point, even in contrast, compared with previous results, which were not inconsistent with a 2,000-year-old dating. These are experimental data, among others, with the validity and also the limits of sectoral tests, which are to be integrated in a multidisciplinary framework. December 1990. In an article published in the New American, STURP member Kenneth Stevenson said, according to their own published reports, they, Dr. Tite's C14 researchers, discarded readings that didn't fit what they wanted. From their own figures, they were as much as 400 years off on the low end, and on the high end, 1,500 years off, which is pretty significant. Several of the C14 team members made public statements before the testing to the effect that it's a fake and we're going to prove it, which tends to taint their credibility from the start. June 1993. At an international Shroud Symposium held in Rome, statistician Philippe Boursier de Carbone, and his last name is spelled C-A-R-B-O-N, carbon, but pronounced Carbone, listed 15 failures in the Shroud C14 procedures. 1, absence of a formal report of the sampling. 2, absence of a video archive on the final steps of the samples packaging. 3, in the official reports, contradictions about the cutting and the weight of the samples by people in charge of sampling. 4, breaches of the protocols initially planned for the operation of dating. 5, rejection of the usual procedure of the double-blind test. 6, refusal of the interdisciplinary documentation, which is usual in the procedures for radiocarbon dating. 7, exclusion of acknowledged specialists in the Shroud, particularly American scientists who participated in previous works of STIRP. 8, communication to the laboratories, most unusual, of the dates of the control samples prior to testing. 9, intercommunication of results among the 3 laboratories during the job. 10, disclosure to the media of the first results before the delivering of the findings. 11, refusal to publish raw results of the measurements. 12, non-explanation of the unique isolation of the confidence interval of the measures performed by the Oxford laboratory compared to those made by other laboratories. 13, unacceptable value of 6.4 published in the journal Nature for the chi-square statistical test on the results of the radiocarbon dosage on the shroud. 14, rejection of any cross-debate on the statistical measures performed. 15, rejection, absolutely uncommon, of the publication of the statistical expertise of this operation officially entrusted to Professor Bray of the G. Colonetti Institute of Turin. Boursier de Carbone concluded, such a remark of deficiencies remains completely unusual in the context of a truly scientific debate, and one can only deplore. Italian author Ernesto Brunati put forth some questions regarding the lab's statistical analysis to both the labs and the British Museum, but did not receive satisfactory answers despite various letters sent to them, as well as numerous publications on the subject by Brunati, who maintained that the shroud samples were not homogeneous and who suspected a deliberate manipulation of the data. Brunati's calculations regarding the non-homogeneity of the samples were confirmed by 2 professors of statistics at La Sapienza University of Rome, Livia De Giovanni and Pier Luigi Conti. 1998, Pierre Savarino, the scientific advisor to a successor of Cardinal Balestrero, stated, the results cannot be considered axiomatically conclusive. 2002, I posted the following to a Shroud blog, shroudstory.com. Great source of information if you want to check that out at some point. In late 2001, my late wife, Sue, and I submitted to Radiocarbon our Orvieto paper. That was the original paper we presented in Italy in the year 2000. In a letter dated January 1st, 2002, Dr. Timothy Joel, editor of the journal Radiocarbon and one of the scientists from the University of Arizona laboratory that dated the shroud in 1988, sent Sue and me a reply regarding the submission of our C14 paper. For those not familiar with the process by which papers are published in scientific journals, the editor chooses various reviewers, usually anonymous to the author and supposedly objective, who then make suggestions to the authors on how to make the paper better. After changes are made, the reviewers read the paper again and make their recommendations to the editor as to whether the paper should be published or not. However, the final decision remains in the hands of the editor. The review of our paper was out of the ordinary insofar as the reviewers were revealed to us, something that doesn't normally occur. They were all originally directly involved in the specific topic of our paper, the 1988 Shroud C14 dating. It was our contention that the C14 dating was skewed due to the presence of a 16th century repair. Here's a list of the reviewers of our paper. The late Paul Damon, head of the Arizona laboratory that participated in the 88 dating. The late Jacques Avon, French C14 expert president at the 1988 dating. The late Gabriel Vial, French towel expert present at the 88 dating. Franco Testore, Italian textile expert present at the 88 dating. The late Harry Gove, inventor of the AMS radiocarbon dating method, who had literally bet a companion that the shroud was medieval and was heavily involved in various aspects of the dating. What were the chances that any of these men, each of whom would publicly look bad if our theory were correct, would want to see our paper published? The answer was obvious. Needless to say, our paper was not accepted. Most interesting was a comment by Avon, who wrote in the review sent by the editor to Sue and me. This is just an interesting quote. The authors, who for several reasons are convinced that the shroud is authentic, want to publish an article in Radiocarbon only to introduce a doubt about the dating. All people involved in the sampling and in laboratory analyses will be very angry with these suspicions turning on so an important mistake or a misconduct. Now, I'm not exactly sure what he meant there, but he sure sounds guilty about something. 2005, Monsignor Ghiberti was quoted in the Italian newspaper Avvenire regarding Ray Rogers' finding in the thermochemical actor paper, in which he concluded that the C14 sample was not representative of the main cloth, and I'll have a quote from that in my next presentation. Ghiberti says that he was surprised that a specialist like Rogers could be so imprecise. However, the January 2005 newsletter of the Centro Sindone made some positive remarks and concluded, in conclusion, Dr. Rogers' observations are very interesting and certainly provide a basis for further investigation and studies on the chemical characteristics of the cloth and its possible inhomogeneity. Unfortunately, there's been no further investigation since then. 2008. Christopher Ramsey, who was involved in the 1988 dating and is currently the head of the Oxford lab, wrote a general article on C14 dating and stated, when radiocarbon date outliers, that is, dates that don't make sense archaeologically, are encountered, these are sometimes due to some measurement problem, but much more often they are due to misinterpretation of the sample context. That certainly has some application to the shroud dating. 2008, Sturp chemist Ray Rogers wrote in a posthumously published book, in many cases where questions arise, an appeal is made to authority. There can be no question about the authority of the radiocarbon investigators. However, true scientists like to see all loose ends questioned and tested. With the shroud, neither the radiocarbon investigators nor the authorities in Turin have cooperated in attempts to resolve the dating problem. The church officials appear to be content to have society view the shroud as a medieval hoax, and the radiocarbon laboratories have refused to consider the possibility that they were given a spurious sample. In a manner uncharacteristic of rigorous scientists, they refuse to allow observations on retained samples. They also refuse to do their own simple chemical observations. They refuse to discuss or show any photomicrographs of samples they might have. This kind of action is all too characteristic of shroud studies. Emotions tend to overwhelm science. The sample was approved at the time of sampling by two textile experts, Franco Testore, professor of textile technology at the Turin Polytechnic, and Gabriel Vial, curator of the Ancient Textile Museum, Lyon, France. No chemical or microscopic investigations were made to characterize the sample. I believe that was a major disaster in the history of shroud studies. Control samples should always be retained to enable confirmation of results at a later date. Retained samples, if any, have not been made available for study. This leads one to question the ethics or rigor of any scientist involved in the process. Is something being hidden? In the introduction to an article in Nuclear Instruments and Methods in Physics Research B about dating textile relics of the medieval period using the same C14 technique used on the shroud, M.E. Fede et al. Wrote, quote, dating of materials connected to faith is always a delicate matter. However, the goal of this paper is not the one of emphasizing the results themselves, but the methodology used, and especially the importance of a correct strategy of sampling. In their results and conclusion section, they stated, the most important aspect of this work, from the point of view of physicists working in the field of AMS dating, is the one concerning sampling strategy. First, sampling should always be done in agreement with and under the guidance of scholars and peoples involved in the historical or archaeological problem. In addition, whenever possible, collecting several samples from the object to be dated is definitely the right approach in order to reduce the possibility of ambiguities, end quote. It's a shame that those guidelines weren't followed in the case of the Shroud. December 2009, Christopher Ramsey of the Oxford Lab authored a paper titled Dealing with Outliers and Offsets in Radiocarbon Dating, in which he stated 4 reasons why C14 dates could be incorrect. 1, the radiocarbon measurement of a particular sample might not be correct. 2, the radiocarbon ratio of a sample might be different from that of an associated reservoir. 3, a whole set of radiocarbon measurements might be biased in some way relative to the calibration curve, either because the measurements themselves are biased or because the reservoir from which the sample draws its carbon might not have the expected radiocarbon isotope ratio. 4, the sample measured might not relate to the timing of the event being dated. One has to ask why so many scientists and even church officials are unwilling to consider these points when it comes to the Shroud. Author Mark Oxley wrote in a book, "It has to be concluded that the opaqueness of the procedures regarding the cutting and wrapping of the samples in Turin in 1988, the many unanswered questions surrounding the samples, not least the whereabouts of the smaller piece sent to Arizona, the questions about the tests themselves, notably the small sizes of the samples used, and the failure to make use of detailed screening and testing procedures, and the subsequent studies that have called into question the dates given by all the tests, all combine to deliver a fatal blow to the credibility and validity of the radiocarbon test results. They should be consigned to the scientific dustbin where they belong. Science relies on precision, attention to detail, accurate record keeping, proper reporting of results, and impartiality on the parts of scientists. All of these have been lacking in this sorry episode," end quote. 2011, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone stated, "The analysis of C14 seems to have been a mistake, particularly because of prejudices of which it is useless to speak, because the verdict was decided even before performing the analyses." 2011. Emanuela Marinelli said that when Tite was asked if there was any official report on the sample taking, he said, "Ask Ganella, that wasn't my job." Dr. Jewell emailed me on January 26, 2009, saying, quote, "We need to move beyond the process and politics of the original event. They are not relevant now," end quote. I could not disagree more. If the politics affected the rigor of the experiment, and there is absolutely no doubt that they did, it is most relevant, even though we are almost 3 decades after the original testing. We can continue to hope that the Catholic Church will soon allow some new testing. The living Pope may be the legal owner of the Shroud, but I believe the cloth belongs to the whole world. Thank you for your attention.
Testing.